My brother got my wife pregnant, so I erased my entire family from my life. No fights, no closure, just silence, so loud it ruined them. I am a biochemist. I work with controlled experiments, predictable reactions, measurable outcomes. Every day I walk into a laboratory where chaos is something you neutralize, where variables are something you eliminate, where the answer to any problem is always found through precision and patience and the willingness to start completely over when a formula does not work. You would think that kind of training prepares you for anything life decides to throw at you. It does not. Nothing prepares you for the specific, surgical destruction of everything you thought was real. I came home on a Tuesday. The drive took 14 minutes instead of the usual 22 because traffic was unusually light for that time of evening. I stopped for gas at the station 2 blocks from our house, the one with the broken fluorescent light above pump number 4 that had been flickering for approximately 8 months. I stood there in the cooling evening air and thought about what to make for dinner. Pasta, probably. Something easy. I remember that thought clearly because of how obscenely ordinary it was. The whole drive home was like that. Aggressively, mundanely, almost insultingly normal. Renata was sitting at the kitchen table when I walked in, not cooking, not scrolling her phone the way she usually did when she was waiting for me, not watching something on the small television mounted under the cabinet, just sitting there with her hands folded flat on the table, staring at a point somewhere past the salt shaker, past the wall, past everything. Her eyes were red and slightly swollen in the specific way that tells you a person has already done the crying. The main event was over. Whatever this was, I was walking into the aftermath. I set my bag down on the counter, the same worn brown leather bag I had carried to work every single day for 6 years, the one with the fraying strap I kept meaning to replace, and I waited. She told me she was pregnant. My brain, trained by years of laboratory work to receive data and process it without emotional contamination, tried to do the math automatically. We had been careful. We were not trying. We had talked about it vaguely, in that non-committal way couples do when they mean someday, but not yet. Still, these things happen. Biology is not a perfect system. I opened my mouth to ask the normal questions. The ones a husband asks when his wife delivers unexpected but not catastrophic news. She cut me off before I formed the first syllable. The baby was not mine. It was my brother Dominic's. The thing about real shock, the deep structural kind, is that it is completely quiet. There is no dramatic music that swells from somewhere. There is no slow motion, no visible distortion of reality. There is just a strange, almost clinical pause where your brain receives a signal it does not know how to route, where it searches for the correct folder and finds nothing there. I stood in my own kitchen with the smell of the coffee she had brewed at some point still faint in the air, and I felt the entire architecture of my life shift 2 inches to the left while the walls stayed exactly where they were. I found words. I asked who knew. She told me there had been a meeting the previous day. A meeting. Like a board of directors convening to address a crisis. Her, Dominic, my mother, my father. The 4 of them had sat down somewhere, at my parents' dining room table, I assumed, the same table where we had eaten Christmas dinner 3 weeks earlier, and they had discussed my life and made decisions about my future, and not one of them had thought to include me in that conversation. Not me. I walked to the living room slowly, the way you move when your body is still operating on autopilot while your mind is somewhere else entirely, and I called my mother. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was warm and casual, the way it always was, asking how work had been, whether I was tired, whether I had eaten. The complete normalcy of her tone was its own kind of violence. I told her I knew. The warmth drained out of her voice like water through a crack, instantly and completely, replaced by something careful and measured and rehearsed. She told me that family is family. She told me we needed to sit down together and figure this out as a unit. I could hear my father in the background, his low voice telling her to tell me we would work through it. Together. I repeated the word back to her out loud. Together. The 4 of them had already spent an entire day figuring it out without the one person most directly affected. I hung up without saying anything else. Renata had appeared in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room. She was watching me with an expression I had never seen on her face before, something halfway between guilt and a desperate, almost performative hope, like she was still calculating whether this situation had a version where things worked out for her. She asked what I was going to do. I looked at her, really looked at her, the way you look at a slide under a microscope when you are trying to see something clearly instead of just confirming what you expected to find. 6 years. I had known this woman for 6 years. I had chosen her. I had built a life around the fundamental assumption that I knew who she was and who my brother was and who my parents were. Standing in that living room with the evening light going flat and gray through the windows, I understood that I had been running an experiment with contaminated data from the start and simply had not known it. I said nothing. I walked past her, back down the hallway, into the bedroom we had shared, and I pulled my old leather bag back out from the closet. I began packing. Clothes first, enough for 2 weeks, then my laptop, chargers, my passport, the folder of documents from the file cabinet in the corner, the one that held my birth certificate, my degrees, my financial records, the deed to the house. I worked methodically, calmly, the way I would break down a workstation at the end of a long project. Clean, systematic, final. She came to the doorway of the bedroom. She was crying again now, the real kind this time, not the controlled aftermath version from the kitchen. She grabbed my arm and begged me to yell at her. She said she needed me to say something, anything, that she could not stand the silence. She wanted a reaction. She wanted anger or grief or desperation or any signal that I was willing to stay inside the emotional reality of what had just happened long enough to negotiate with her. I understood that. A reaction would have given her something to work with. Silence gave her nothing. I pulled my arm free gently, without anger, and I walked out of the bedroom. She was still calling my name when I closed the front door behind me. That night, I checked into a hotel 40 minutes from the house and sat at the small desk beside the window and began making a list. Not an emotional list, a logistical one. I had been a biochemist for 11 years. I had run projects that required absolute precision across hundreds of interdependent variables. The dissolution of an entire life, I decided, was simply another project. It required the same clarity, the same discipline, the same willingness to be ruthless about what worked and what did not. By noon the following day, I had opened a new individual bank account at a bank Renata had no history with and transferred exactly half of our joint savings, $54,000 and some change. Mathematically clean, legally unchallengeable. I called my company's payroll department and rerouted my direct deposit to the new account. I contacted our insurance provider and had Renata removed from every policy. I did not feel anything dramatic while doing any of this. It was data management. It was closing tabs. Then I called the divorce attorney. Her name was Eleanor. She had floor-to-ceiling windows in her downtown office, and her furniture was the kind that costs more than most families spend on cars. Her assistant asked me to describe the situation. I said it was uncomplicated. The house was mine. I had purchased it 2 years before the wedding for $280,000. I had never added Renata to the deed. I had fully intended to, at some point, in the vague way that you intend to replace a fraying bag strap. I never had. Lucky me, as it turned out. Eleanor told me the case was as clean as she had ever seen. I told her I wanted everything handled through her office with no direct communication to Renata or her representatives, no mediation sessions, no offers to meet in the middle, and absolutely no closure. She told me she understood completely and started drafting the next morning. The papers were filed within 48 hours. A process server delivered them to the house, along with a 30-day eviction notice, on a Thursday morning when I knew Renata would be home. I was 300 miles away by then, sitting in a coffee shop in a city I had scouted remotely, waiting on a lease to be countersigned. I changed my phone number that same evening. Then I sat down with my contacts list and went through it name by name. Mother, father, Dominic, Renata, her parents, her sister, my aunts, my uncles. 3 cousins I had been reasonably close to, colleagues who were also social connections. Everyone who might know someone who might pass information to someone who might give any of them a thread to pull. I blocked every single one, then I deleted them. Then I submitted my transfer request internally, citing a project need in the new city, which was true enough that it required no further explanation. My manager approved it in 2 days. I signed the remote lease. I arranged movers for the personal items still in the house, handled entirely through Eleanor's office, with a scheduled window when Renata would be required, legally, to vacate the premises for 3 hours. New phone number, new bank, new email built on a name variation nobody in my family had ever used for me. New city, an entire life quietly, methodically, deliberately erased and rebuilt in under 2 weeks. Not out of rage, out of precision. They tried everything. I learned the scope of it much later, in pieces, through professional channels and a mutual contact outside the family circle who reached out to my work email by some miracle of deduction, and who I eventually chose to respond to after a long period of silence. Renata hired her own attorney almost immediately, but Eleanor had built a wall around the asset question that was essentially impenetrable. The house was mine before the marriage and exclusively documented as such. The savings split was exact and preemptive. There was nothing to fight over that would be worth the cost of fighting. The divorce was finalized in 4 months. I was not present. Eleanor handled everything. My mother wrote letters, real ones, on paper, addressed to my old workplace, which forwarded them as a courtesy once before I asked them to stop. I read the first one. She wrote about family loyalty and forgiveness, and the idea that what happened was painful for everyone involved. She did not use the word betrayal once. She referred to Dominic's behavior as a mistake, the way you refer to a spilled glass or a miscalculation. I set the letter down on my new kitchen counter and did not feel what she had written it hoping I would feel. I felt a quiet, settled clarity instead. The kind that comes when an experiment finally confirms what you already suspected. Dominic called my old number for 3 weeks before it was fully deactivated. He sent messages through the family email chain that I never received because that account had been closed. He showed up at my old office once, according to a former colleague who mentioned it in a LinkedIn message I saw months later. He stood in the lobby and asked for me. He was told I no longer worked there. He stood there for a while, according to the colleague, looking like a person who had expected a door and found a wall. My parents hired a private investigator, a reasonably competent one apparently, because he did trace my general location to the new city. But Eleanor had already consulted with a privacy attorney on my behalf, and the contact protocol I had established was tight enough that he could confirm the city and nothing else. He could not get an address. He could not get a phone number. He filed his report. My parents received it, and then there was simply nothing they could do with it because I had not committed a crime. I had left. That is a thing people are allowed to do. What it cost them materialized over the months and years that followed, and I heard about it the way you hear about weather in a place you used to live, distantly, through secondhand accounts that confirmed patterns you had already anticipated. Renata and Dominic did not stay together. That particular outcome required almost no predictive modeling on my part. The relationship had been built in secret under conditions of maximum pressure and zero accountability. Dominic, who had never once in his adult life been forced to fully reckon with the consequences of his own choices because there had always been a family infrastructure there to absorb the damage, found out what accountability actually felt like when the person who had always quietly cleaned up after him was no longer present. Renata, who I now understood had been capable of extraordinary compartmentalization, found that the version of Dominic she had chosen was considerably less appealing when he was not forbidden. They separated before the child was 2 years old. My parents aged badly through it. Not in the simple physical way that time produces, but in the specific, accelerated way that prolonged, unresolved grief produces. My mother, who had managed the family's social identity with tremendous energy for decades, found that the story she had constructed about what had happened and why I had gone was not a story the extended family fully believed. People who had known me also knew me well enough to do their own math. The warmth that had characterized my parents' social circle contracted noticeably. Holiday gatherings grew smaller. The phone rang less. My father, who had been in the background of that phone call telling my mother to tell me we would work through it together, the pronoun carrying the full weight of everything he had misunderstood about the situation, developed a health issue in his mid-60s that required significant ongoing care. I know about this because the mutual contact told me, not because I was asked to respond to it, but because the contact thought I should know. I received that information and held it carefully. I thought about it for a long time. I made no decision quickly. There is a version of this story where I come back, where I arrive at some necessary moment of family crisis, and the return is framed as healing, as growth, as the proof that time softens everything. That version is clean and satisfying and sells a particular idea about what forgiveness is supposed to look like. I understand why it exists. People need that version. I did not go back. I want to be precise about why, because I think it matters. It was not because the anger had not faded. Anger is an acute state, and acute states do not persist indefinitely. It was because the return would have required me to accept a framework in which what was done to me was categorized as a mistake, a thing that happened, a chapter that closes. And I had thought about it long enough and carefully enough to know that what actually happened was a deliberate series of choices made by 4 adults who valued their own comfort over my right to exist as a full participant in my own life. That is not a mistake. That is a decision, and decisions have consequences. I live in a different city now. I have for several years. I have colleagues I respect, and a few friendships that are genuine and a laboratory that produces work I am proud of. I have a routine I built from scratch, around my own preferences, without the weight of inherited obligation shaping every corner of it. There is a woman I have been seeing for about a year, someone who is careful with information and honest about difficult things. 2 qualities I have come to understand I should have paid closer attention to before. People ask me sometimes whether the silence was a punishment, whether I designed it to hurt them, and the honest answer is that the silence was not for them at all. It was not a weapon aimed at anyone. It was the only rational response to the discovery that the environment I had been operating in was irreparably contaminated. In a laboratory, when you discover contamination, you do not negotiate with it. You do not hold a meeting to determine how everyone feels about it. You sterilize. You start over. You build clean conditions, and you protect them with everything you have. That is what I did. The silence was loud enough to ruin them not because I engineered it that way, but because people who have never experienced genuine accountability tend to shatter when they finally meet it. That is not my calculation. That is just chemistry.